Uiteindelijk moet je gewoon beginnen.
Zou ik hem links of rechts doen? Dat voelt natuurlijk. Hallo mensen. Hallo mensen.
Ja, of je kan ook zo, hè?
Dat is laatst een comedy gewassen. Dat ik die gast de eerste keer is heel nerveus. Goedemiddag allemaal. Goedemiddag allemaal, ik ben Randy. Mijn naam is Randy Semelaar. Bedankt dat jullie hier allemaal aanwezig zijn op het QXD. Ik ben vandaag zaalmoderator in deze zaal. Een bescheiden rol naast al die mooie sprekers. Naast me staat Jochem Feekes. Zijn praatje gaat over level up your test environments. En ja, daar gaat hij zo mee van start. Nog even wat huishoudelijke zaken. Wat betreft de vragen, als je een vraag hebt. Er zit zo meteen een Mentimeter in Jochems verhaal. En hij wil graag de vragen na die Mentimeter doen. Dus dan kan je het even bewaren voor daarna. Omdat we ook kijkers thuis hebben. Ook iedereen die thuis kijkt of op kantoor of waar dan ook. Allemaal welkom natuurlijk. Als je een vraag hier in de zaal stelt, zal ik hem ook nog even herhalen. Dat mensen thuis hem ook goed kunnen horen. Er is ook een chat-applicatie. Dus mocht je wat verlegen zijn, kan je die ook gebruiken om de vraag te stellen. En natuurlijk de mensen thuis kunnen die sowieso gebruiken om een vraag te stellen. En dan zal ik hem ook uit de chat vissen en hem dan voorlezen. En wat nieuw is nu, is dat er gereed kan worden. Dus ja, misschien handig om er na te doen, maar kan misschien ook tijdens. Kan je het verhaal raten en dan wat feedback teruggeven. Met een 5-sterren rating, geloof ik. Kijk even of ik niet vergeten ben.
Dat is de enige optie, toch? Okay.
Ja, laat alsjeblieft 5 sterren achter. Nee hoor, naar eigen inzicht uiteraard. Ja, dat was het. Jochem is een oud collega van ons bij Sogeti. Dus hartstikke leuk en tof dat hij even terugkomt om zijn verhaal te vertellen vandaag. En dan wil ik jullie aandacht vragen voor Jochem Feekes.
Het verhaal is in het Engels overigens, hè? Dat,
oh ja, dat was ik even vergeten. Okay, who here doesn't speak Dutch? Sorry about that. Okay, so the story is in English. Quick recap. You can rate the story. You can rate the presentation with the online platform. For all the English people at home, sorry we started off in Dutch. And Jochem is an old colleague from us from Sogeti, so we're very happy that he will join us here to tell his story. And if you have any questions, please save them for after the Mentimeter. That's in the presentation. For the people in the space here, you can ask the question after the Mentimeter, and I'll repeat it for the people at home. People at home can just use the chat app. If you're here, you can also use the chat app if you're really shy and don't want to say it out loud. So have a good talk. Over to Jochem.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and everybody back home as well. Happy to be here in person, but I'm probably not the only one saying this today. Today I want to take you through leveling up your test environment on some examples that we see in the market, some customers that we've guided through the process, and some other observations I've made in the market to maybe help you inspire or maybe change some paradigms that you have in the testing field. Obviously, I'm also curious for your reactions afterwards, so feel free to join me downstairs. But for now, let me take you through it. First, briefly, who am I? I work as a solution consultant with Parasoft, one of the software companies in quality assurance. And back before I joined Parasoft, I used to work indeed with Capgemini and Sogeti both within Europe, which was in the same field, I have to say. More importantly, I like to build stuff, so I built my own home or redecorated it, completely refurbished everything. I like climbing, and I like the combination of both, because seeing tangible results other than sometimes the PowerPoints that you present can be very fulfilling. So without further ado, why talk about test environments? Now, I think most of you might be familiar or are familiar with the World Quality Report published every year. Actually, later today, if I'm not mistaken, there's a talk on it as well. And if you look at the contents of it, there are a couple of topics that continue to be there in the top tier. And one of them is test data management and test environment management. And what strikes me as interesting is it has been on top for quite some years already, but in conversations you still sense that people have difficulty, okay, well, what does it actually mean? How do I go about it? because it's much more than the simple activity. So we'll dive into that a bit more throughout this presentation. But before we can do that, we have to find common ground, right? What is the definition? What are we actually talking about? Now, if we try Wikipedia or Google, that's our best friend generally speaking, we come up with this definition. And just to go through it, test environment management is a function in the software delivery process allowing us a validated and stable and usable environment to execute our test cases or to replicate bugs. And those key terms, validated, stable, and usable, those are actually the things that I want to talk about today. Because that's where the challenge sits for most of us. This is the ideal. This is what everybody dreams of having. But generally, when you talk to everybody, and yourselves probably included as well, you know, it might be good if you have a validated environment, because often you have to share, right? Smile of recognition, I guess. All right, fine, sharing. We can communicate with each other. And I've been in different environments where they say, yes, well, we have this test environment, we have a multitude of them, and we have acceptance environments. And you know what? We also have a connected environment where you have all the functionality of our company available. Well, what do you think everybody does? Why should I use an empty environment if I have a connected environment? So everybody goes to that connected environment, releases their software, and effectively you have a environment. You don't know what runs in it, because your colleague probably released the next version of one of the apps. So you're left with a environment which you can use for testing. Well, if we bring back the topic of this event and we talk about leveling up, then I think, you know, the baby lizard is where everybody starts, where you're not 100% sure of what you're doing, or maybe you don't have the budget yet to do what you aim to do. But once you've become that full-fledged dragon, that's utopia, right? That's what we're hoping to achieve. So before talking about how can we get there, I want to go and take one step back. Because generally we can learn a lot from history, right? Where are we coming from? Because if we know where we're coming from, that can help us make wiser decisions to move into the future. So once upon a time, there was the monolith. This was the application where everything was in one big application. All the features, all the functionalities was in one big complex piece of code, of software. And as time progressed, we've added the SOA architecture, service-oriented architecture. We started splitting things up because it was much easier to work together, to communicate, to make progress, to evolve our applications and our business as such. And then these days, we're often in the space where we say, you know, microservices. For some, it's a holy grail. Some accept it as a nice new technology, which you can leverage as well. But these are effectively the three main eras that you can define. Now, before we go any further, I'm actually curious to gauge the audience to see where are you at, or your customers, if you're consulting, and also for the people back home. If you could please, you can either scan the QR code or go to menti.com and enter the 8 digits. I'm actually curious if we can get it up on the screen to see where are we headed. I'm actually frankly, don't speak too soon. See some good discussion, so that's also good. There are honest people here. Well, actually, we have a competition heading here. And I'm very curious who's going to win. This feels like the camel races back in when I used to go to the carnival. Maybe I should take your bets now, actually. Well, I think what's the most important that we already see, there is not one truth, right? Everybody is dealing with their own reality, their own legacy, maybe even. Yeah, I'm sure they'll continue to drop in. This competition makes me not want to move forward. Maybe we should, though. If we continue, I think it's very interesting to see, and it is in the line of expectations. I was expecting a little bit less monolith. So that's an interesting conversation to be had. Front-end, back-end, microservices, often you see it's a mix of the two, right? Microservices, there are heavy debates online, but is it the holy grail? I think not, but that's my personal opinion. It's a combination of worlds that makes it valuable and how you want to deliver business value. If we move back to, thank you, the presentation, you also see another development in the market, and that's the micro front ends. They're closely related. A very familiar example in the market is Spotify. Numerous talks have been given on this topic already, but briefly, if you open Spotify, every function you see, whether it's suggestions, whether it's the search bar, whether it's the play bar, whether it's your favorites, they're all separate teams who are responsible for their own micro front end in the bigger front end of Spotify. And if you close your eyes a little bit and you look at the market, there are more examples that you see happening. And this is within one organization, but if I take a Dutch example, bol.com, I'm not saying that they develop software like this, but what you see is that bol.com takes responsibility for their platform. So they make sure that you get inspired by different products. They make sure that you can find the products that you're searching for. And when you look at the products that they're featuring on their platform, it's not only their own. They've invited other companies to run their store on their platform. It's the platform economy. And when you find a nice product of maybe one of the thousands of vendors, then what you do, you go and check out that product, and then you see when you make your payment that it's not bol.com who's executing your payment. No, it's a third party. In this case, it's either Ingenico or DocData. And what we don't become aware of is that today in business, what's actually happening is we're not doing business alone. We're not in it alone. We're part of a business ecosystem. And it might be very simplistic, but to explain the workings of a business ecosystem, if I spot a business opportunity where people are thirsty and they're keen to have a lemonade and they got money to spend, and I discovered that when you go to the gym, for example, that there are a lot of people with a lot of thirst, then the next challenge is, okay, well, me and my brother, we want to run this lemonade stand, and in order to do so, we need to make lemonade, so we need groceries. We get the products we need, we find a facility to make those products, and we arrange our logistics to make sure our products get to the point of sale. And if that all works well, and all these different parties take their responsibility and understand how they're part of the value chain, only then we're actually able to make money, or create value, get value in return. And this very simplistic manner is what you see happening in the market more and more. Everybody takes responsibility for their niche. They're not particularly Dutch examples, but they're known in the Dutch space. Senseo is a relatively established one, where two companies, they put their hands together and they started creating a machine, or a joint product actually, to bring more value to the consumer, to us. Sonos, IKEA have done the same. Sonos quite exclusive, but also accessible for exclusive brands. Together with IKEA, they created a speaker that's affordable and functional as well within the IKEA philosophy. Now, these are products in the market that you can buy. You see the same trend happening within software industry. And there it becomes a little bit different, and we'll talk about that, because it's now software companies working together. We have open banking, maybe this is an app that allows you to get all your news sources into one space. It's almost like the old RSS feed that maybe some of you still know. But the same goes for healthcare. And effectively what's happening there is that the industry as such is learning a new skill. Now, I'm going to take you on a sidetrack here, because recently I learned myself, maybe not so successful, welding. I thought, let's learn a new skill. So what do? You go to YouTube, you go to Google, you find the how-tos, and I'm not going to show you all my field products, but this is actually one that I'm pretty proud of. It's just a place to hide my TV, but it's full of mistakes. I think it's still pretty cool, but it's full of mistakes. And if you look at what comes to learning a new skill, what's important is that you define the task. What do you need to do? You get insights on the conditions under which you want to complete that task. And then thirdly, you look at the standards. When is good enough? If you look at those three things, then you can say, I've learned a new task and I've mastered it as well. Well, I haven't mastered it because my conditions in my garage were horrible. So I won't go into that, but that leaves for another story. But these are the three most important components, and effectively we're doing exactly the same to software. We're taking them through these three steps as well. I want to take in a new paradigm, because we're here to also look, okay, how is the industry working and what can we learn from that? Back when I was working for Capgemini still, there was a project where one of the energy providers, they were building a lot of windmills and they needed to train their engineers. Now, if you want to train your engineer in maintaining a windmill, they aren't always in convenient places, right? So you have to in order to train, you have to get the engineer, get them to the windmill, get a boat, get a captain, get an instructor, they all go to sea to train their activities. Now they thought this can be better, more cost effective, and as such, they looked around what technology is out there and how can we train our people. Instead of bringing the person to the environment, they brought the environment to the person. They just put the VR goggles on, and in a real world experience, the person was actually able to experience what it was, up to a certain extent of course, to be in a windmill at sea. This is not new. Maybe this was developed, I think, over 5 years ago, but if we look at the military, for example, back in the day when tanks were still heavily used, the crews had to be trained, and they had to be trained in all different conditions, because in the last Gulf War, it was a desert campaign, so they, can you deal with the tank in the heat in the desert? That's a different experience than when you're up in the mountains or wherever. So they need to train for all these different activities, and again, the same principles applied here. They need to bring not only the person, but also the tank to a particular place to get that training, which was quite costly, time-consuming, and then you would only hope there was snow in the place where you wanted to train. Now, what they said, they looked at the exact same things. We need to complete our task, which is basically to win the battle, win the war, or not lose at least. The standards were really, really clear, but the conditions, they were really hard to manage, because it's very hard to get all that stuff back and forth. So what did they do? They looked what technology is out there, what do we need to achieve, and they said, why not bring the environment to the tank crew? Then we train them all in the place where they are, and they did that. So back in the 80s already, right, 1980, they developed SimNet, which is a large-scale VR simulator endeavor by the US, and they already used virtual reality as part of training their crew. So I think it's already interesting to see that, Eneco as one of those companies, but there are a lot of energy providers that are focusing on training their engineers using virtual reality. It's also in the public space to be found. It's not a new technology, but what is relatively new is they're now in control of all these aspects, but if you look at software development, we're not. And then I'm thinking, if we can plot this story on software development as well, what if the crew that we're training is a piece of software? And what if our allied forces are our upstream systems, our front ends, that are dependent on us to be successful? And what if the downstream systems is the resistance that we're facing, the unknown that we're battling? What if we simulate all that? What if we create a virtual world and use virtual reality in that? And what does that actually mean in our world? That's the thing that I actually like you to think about a little bit, because in the world where we're developing code, we're developing games, where we're creating virtual experience for everybody but ourselves. That kind of boggles my mind here and there. Now, if we take it on a different tour, and then maybe some of you still recognize this, I'll explain it for some of you. When we used to take photographs, you had to put a film in, and you would have to go to either the HEMA or a place where you would develop this film, and then you would see your pictures. And in the olden days, it would maybe take up to 10 days. You take your picture, you go back home from holiday, you go into the store, you develop it. A couple days later, you would get your picture. Now, the industry realized this is not what we want. We want something much more optimized, more cost-effective and faster. So they said we can optimize that. 1-hour delivery services on the spot. We'll do it for you. And there were companies that were battling that and said, you know, we can do even better. Polaroid was one of those companies. They said, on-the-spot development, 15 minutes instead of an hour. And they've invested a hell lot in improving that process, and they use new mechanicals, new papers, and improved it to 10 minutes. The one thing that they forgot about is to look around, what's happening. Digital photography happened. Instant gratification. I think it fits a lot of our generation that, you know, we want something now. We don't want it tomorrow or the day after. It's the same with same-day delivery. We're really impatient. So that instant having of what we need is something that we're craving in this day and age. Now, if we plot that on software development, to come back to the topic where you came from, in my view, the software film is our traditional environment where everybody is doing their thing. That went a little fast. The Polaroid is test environment management as we see test environment management tooling these days. Because what does that tooling do? It says, I put a big gate in front of my test environment, and you can now book a time slot. If you book that time slot, then the environment is yours. Up till then, you have to wait. Okay, you get your time slot, you execute your tests. If you get into trouble, or you run into something, or you find an issue, then you can book a new time slot, and then it's your turn in a week or so, if you're unlucky. So is this really what we want? In my opinion, no. There's a different technology that supports test environment management. It doesn't replace it, it supports it. And that's service virtualization, which is effectively what we used to know back in the day as mocking and stubbing, but on steroids. It's building advanced simulators so that we can have the perception of an environment, much like the VR goggles. Because I don't know if you guys ever had VR goggles on and did the Frankie plank challenge. Back in the office, we would have a wooden plank on the floor, no risk. You put people the VR goggles on, they would start crawling because they were afraid. Not because there was actually height, but the perception of it made it so. And that's what service virtualization can do as well for those software applications. And to plot that again on these topics, I think where you look at the traditional test environment management, traditional test environments, you're really in that baby lizard stage. And if you really leverage test environment management with service virtualization or with simulators, then you're fully in control. And then you can give the control also to the people that are actually using those environments. So now I'm actually curious. Provided this context, I would like to invite you to go again to Menti, and I would like you to rate yourself. Are you that full-fledged dragon, or are you maybe early stages developing lizard into an alligator of sorts? Actually, Emil, in the meantime, can we go one step back? I'm very curious what the outcome was of the final outcome. Front and back end won it from the microservices. Oh, some more even. Thank you. Now, I'm really happy to see that the average number is already on the higher side and that people have evolved past the unvalidated, unusable test environments into at least validated environments and maybe a step further. And maybe this is actually the time that we can take some questions if there are already some questions.
We have no questions from the chatters at home yet, but if there are any in here in the house, feel free. Yeah, please go ahead.
What's your opinion about contract-based testing?
Sorry, on contract-based testing.
Yeah, is that your first position, or is it?
It's a very good first step.
Sorry, Jochem, I didn't catch that. About what?
What's your opinion about contract-based testing?
Yeah, so what's Jochem's opinion about contract-based testing?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Contract-based testing is really good about knowing who's dependent on you, right? And it provides a lot of information on what the integration is expecting, what you can expect of it. So that contract allows you to get clarity on, okay, well, we can communicate and we talk the same language. But if you want to go one step beyond that, where you say, I want to mimic system behavior, or if you want to say, you know, it's Black Friday, will my web shop hold? You cannot control the back-end behavior of that system. And that's where the limitations of contract-based testing are. It's a very good first step, becoming in control of your environments and who you're providing information to. Because the downside, if you're not using contract-based testing, also, it's a very good method if everybody adheres to the way of working. But if you don't do it, then you don't know who's consuming your information. And then it's kind of, okay, let's shut it off and see who screams, because you don't know. Contract-based testing is a good solution to that, to get clarity on who's communicating in what way. But if you want to go one step beyond that, then it lacks capabilities. And it feeds perfectly well into all of the methods, and I'll shed some light on that a little bit later as well. It's the combination of methods that make us mature in the software development. So far, I haven't seen the silver bullet, although we're all trying to either develop it or find it, but it's not there yet. Yep. Any other questions for now? All right. So right now, I'd like to take you through 4 examples that I've worked with in the market. These are more or less timelines. I'll shed some light on ADAZ, I'll explain what they do as well, of VZ. An example of open banking in PSD2 is the official name of European legislation, and then what that has led to. So diving into ADAZ, ADAZ is basically the data hub around energy infrastructure in the Netherlands. So we have our house here, we pay our electricity bills, and we can pay our electricity bills because ADAZ is providing the energy suppliers with our usage information. It provides I don't have a good, the guys that maintain the network, the infrastructure through which our gas and electricity goes. Tenet is one of them, stayed in. ADAZ is providing them all the information for them to make educated decisions, whether it needs maintenance, whether a new invoice needs to be sent. So they're in control of all the data on that entire infrastructure. So they started out as really transactional, and now they've matured into really a data hub where all these parties, and as you can see, it's, well, 131 energy providers that you and I have contracts with. There are another 64 program responsibles. There are 86 other companies dependent on that information, and they're all dependent on the information and the integration with that data hub. So you can already see there's a lot of parties involved. If we think back to the business ecosystem, they're dependent on ADAZ to be available, reliable, usable. So what they did, and I'll focus first here on the right, they had their own test and acceptance environments, and development was happening here as well. And it was all good and well to bring their own product to a level of maturity that they achieved, but then how do you take your partners, your over 200 partners, how do you bring them along? So they had their production environments, oh, wrong button. There we go. So they had their own production environment through which all the partners were able to connect. But how do you let the partners validate their software development efforts against your environment? So what they eventually did is they created their own little VR environment, the virtualized environment, and they published that in the production environment as well. So this was a very early stage of providing a sandbox environment for those parties, the partners, to connect to and to validate if they were actually doing a proper job in communicating. It's much like a service-oriented architecture or microservices, but across company borders. So they were in a high level of maturity. Now, what did they really do? They said, what do we want to test? It's application under test. And that the same goes for the third parties. So that's the only thing they need access to. So to rethink that process, what they did is, we don't need a database, we can simulate the database. In order for this application to work, they need an answer if they ask a question. We don't need a database for that. It's the same if I would record my voice with my name, and I say, okay, what's my name? And I can play the recording. I don't need me in person. Next up is additional services that they were dependent on. They would simulate that also. The mainframe was taken out of the equation. And with that, they really could look different at how they were approaching the whole situation. So these simulators were put into production, and the only thing that they then needed to do is, okay, well, how we're going to leverage these simulations to achieve our results, right? When we talk about the task, the conditions, and the standard, they said, okay, this is the standard. If you test in this way, then you're good to go. So that's just a little bit of rethinking of how they would onboard their partners. Jumping to the next, VZ. Healthcare, it's a foundation that has been erected because the government was looking into electronic patient data. The government said, this is not our responsibility. So they gave the responsibility back to the market, to the hospitals, the healthcare providers, the insurance companies, and they said, this is your challenge, you solve it. As such, they said, this is still a very important task, so they erected the foundation VZ, whose sole responsibility is to facilitate healthcare infrastructure between all parties. So I thought I'll take you through their system diagram, but then I thought that's going to maybe be too much, so I simplified it. And effectively what's happening is that all these parties, research has shown they're much more effective in providing healthcare, in creating a healthier population if they work together. And working together means sharing information. So the doctor office, they use a particular software that gives them patient data, as do all these other organizations. So if you went to the hospital and then you come to the doctor's office, you want the doctor to know what information was provided or what findings were had in the hospital. And the same go for the status with your physio, maybe the medication that you've been provided. And what's even more important here is it's very sensitive data, right? So how are you going to create like a vault? You're not going to let anybody access this network, this information, this data hub. So here they effectively did the same, where they said, if we're going to onboard new players in this information hub, let's create again a sandbox environment. And it's slightly different than the previous one, right? The previous one, ADAZ, it was actually government driven. They said, well, we need to play fair with all the energy providers, and we don't want 10 gas lines next to one another, which each a different owner. No, we want one network. Here it's the market that said we need this. So the market, or FIZ, they created basically a sandbox environment. Again, people could connect to that sandbox environment, software developers, and then say, okay, well, I've shown myself, I've proven myself, now I can connect to the real thing. So it's a very simple example, but it also shows that before allowing or opening up your vault to the outsiders, you've validated them. So again, they also are very much in control of what all goes in their test environment. They even have dedicated spaces for everybody to, because it's copy-paste, it's just everybody has their own dedicated environment. This even actually awarded them to be finalist of Best Use of a Project in 2018 as part with Sogeti. In the UK, this was this election. So this already shows, you know, the market recognizes this as a good example as well. Open banking. Here, I personally think it really becomes interesting because banks, right? It's almost like when you go into a bank, you're welcomed in Fort Knox. We're glad to have you, but please be aware we have a tank to get you the hell out, you know? This is a protected area. You're welcome, but we keep an eye on you. And we're all very used to our banks, our mortgages, that we have apps on our phone that we can access all of that information. And then suddenly the European Union says, you know, all good, but there are other parties, they want to use that information as well. So please open up your gates, open up your vaults, and give this information to those third-party providers. And then you have this third app that allows you to connect everything, make life easier for the consumer. But yeah, you don't really trust that. I mean, you need to open up your safe environment within banks, even if a memo gets out, which has the perception of a hack. You know, the most precious thing the bank has is trust. I trust the bank to keep my money safe. If anything damages that trust, then yeah, you're probably in trouble and people start collecting. So they needed to figure out how to do this. Now, there have been a lot of different solutions to this, but in the most simplistic form, they have their software delivery process, or their life cycle, and they have their production environment. So they said, you know what? We'll copy-paste this, but instead of using actual applications, we'll use simulators. And those simulators have access to a data set, and then the third-party providers, they can connect to that sandbox, they can play around, they can develop their application. We determine how things roll. I mean, it's our infrastructure. This is our thing. But once you've proven yourself, then you're actually allowed to connect to the real thing and get access to the data that you need for your app. Now, you're probably all thinking, yeah, why is this relevant? I mean, the first party is driven by the government. The second one is market. There was a lot of companies together, and now we have this third option that's even enforced by law. Like, what's the business case? Now, to get to that, a bank never lets a crisis go to waste. So what the bank did, they said, you know, okay, we have this technology, we now know how to create those sandbox environments, and we've matured at it. So what's in the next step? In this particular department, there was a packaged solution provider. They were developing their own software which the bank purchased. And they had, I think, about 5 customers, or they have about 5 customers that are heavily using and influencing the development of that software solution. So what that provider does for each bank, they get the configuration, they test against that configuration to see if the new release will function at the bank. And if that's done, then they ship it to the bank's testing environment. The bank, who already matured and has their simulators available, they accept the software, they test it, they accept it, and they move it to production, if all goes well. The configuration that the third party or the package solution provider is using, it's not a validated configuration. It's something that they got someday, they build it maybe in a different code even. So what happens? A lot of back and forth, a lot of defects. And you know, if you have a lot of defects, you need to talk about them, you need to find common ground, you probably get a change control board in place to even discuss it further. Who's going to pay for what? Is this functionality? So there's a whole lot of extra time, cost, and effort involved to go through this particular area. And then all the teams that are working here need to focus on remediating those defects, fixing it, testing it again against this configuration. In lean principles, a lot of waste. So with PSD2 open banking in the back of the mind, they said, you know what, let's try again. Actually initiated by the bank. Guys, you're developing the package. Perfect. You know what, instead of figuring out what we do, why don't you copy our simulators? Get our simulators in your place, we validated them, and you can get a new one every day if you want, or more often. Test against that config, and then you know what? We don't need to test it anymore, because you're testing how we would do it. And if you test how we would do it, then we only need to accept it and move it into prod. Now you can imagine the amount of savings that's piling up on no longer the need for all these communications, change control and whatnot, and even a testing phase that can be repurposed. And I'm not even talking about the savings on this side, where the teams can actually focus on building new functionality instead of remediating the defects. So this is actually the one that gets me most excited when I'm in this industry, that I see, you know, these guys, they put on their VR goggles and they said, how else can we leverage this? And they're now expanding it in their wider ecosystem. Because the biggest challenge that you generally find in today's economy is, I want to get the best product or the best consultancy, the best advice for the lowest price possible. But if you both understand that if this process works, then you're both going to make a whole lot of more money. And that requires trust. Now, and that's generally the challenging bit that I don't have an answer to yet, but I'm happy to see that people are at least having the conversation on, okay, well, how can we optimize our value stream? How can we focus on creating business value as opposed to getting best bang for a buck? So this, for me, this is top dog. Actually, I should have found a different picture on this one. That was an even more fancy dragon. But this is the latest example that I see, and it's not complete. It's not a reality, but the conversations, we're far in the process of validating everything. It's not a reality, but that people having this conversation is the most important piece, in my opinion. Yes?
From the audience at home about this topic.
Yep.
So from Martin, he is wondering, how do you ensure the simulators test data always resembles the real production data?
Well, to be honest, that's a test data management question. That's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
But one of the things that you obviously, when you go back and you have the simulators, I don't have the slides here to go deeper in how a simulator looks like, but a big part of it is test data. And you can couple that in a simple Excel sheet, or you can couple it to a test data management solution. And generally the test data management solutions provide the answer to how to manage that.
Okay, so that's a different talk then.
It is a different talk, yeah. And like I said, this is only one part of a bigger complex solution. And actually, I'll go into that right now, because we know the different levels. And the question is, okay, well, how we're going to get there? I mean, the average was in level 11, more or less. So how do we improve? Now, and I think this is where the companies like Sogeti come in. If you look at opportunities to improve your development efforts, there's a whole range of them. There's a lot of them. And when do you choose which one? And this is when you need good partners to provide you that advice, to evaluate where do you stand now, where do you want to be, and what's the good road to take. Personally, I think if you look at service virtualization, it supports a lot of these areas, and it can only be successful in combination with these areas. A simulator without data doesn't have any value. A combination of simulators make up an environment, but any simulator isn't valuable at all. It's a combination that makes them valuable. So there's a lot of steps to take to get to those next levels, and with that, you know, it is about conversations, about getting that advice and that evaluation. So with that being said, I think this advice can be found with our partner Sogeti. If you're looking to go into service virtualization, we have a customer journey of one of our customers that actually described all the decisions that they had to make that was relevant for them. Because the technology is like a Swiss Army knife. You can use it in a lot of different ways, but you need to use it in a way that's right for you. So this one is available. I think it's even in the download option in the screen, in the portal. So that's for you to download and consume whenever you are. Yeah, and that's actually it for me for today. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Jochem. Any last-minute questions, or we can move on to the next thing? Okay, let's do that then. Jochem, thanks so much for your time and your expertise. Very much appreciated, and always good to have you back, of course. I want to remind the people you can still rate the talk or give feedback afterwards in the platform, so feel free to do that. And talk a little bit about the next session. In this space right here, in half an hour, there will be a talk, how to level up your quality, gamify your strategy, in this space right here. In the downstairs, in the perserij, there will be a World Quality Report 2021-2022 talk. Also on this level, a little bit over there, there will be a talk in Dutch then, I suppose. Schaalbaar kwaliteitsdenken in SAFE, in het douchelokaal op deze verdieping. And also in Dutch, I suppose, eenvoudig SAP testdata verversen bij Holland Casino in de postkamer, also on this floor. For the people at home, of course, you can click to the talk of your interest.
You don't have to walk.
You don't have to walk there, you can just click from your lazy chair. Okay, thanks everybody so much, and hope to see you later at another talk.
Thanks.